Well, today we're going to be talking about ethics in Cambridge. You might actually think of this entire course as something like the decline and fall first, and then the attempt to revive a sense of normativity. We've been talking about the gap between is and ought, between a purely scientific description of the world and then any kind of ethical norm, anything that could give us direction, state an ideal, give us an idea of what we ought to do, what kind of society we ought to have, and so forth. We've seen that by the end of the 19th century, there was already a significant attack against traditional morality, but also more broadly than that, against any conception of morality in the form of relativism, in the form of a Shaw-like cynicism. And then that was amplified tremendously by World War I, the devastation it caused. And so by the 1920s, there was already a significant loss of faith, at least among intellectuals, but it was starting to creep out into the larger populace and beginning to have a huge cultural impact. A group of philosophers at Cambridge University in Great Britain were trying to redefine ethics and what it could be and how we could think about right and wrong, good and evil, virtue and vice. This actually started before the war. G.E. Moore was the ringleader of this group. He wrote his greatest work, Principia Africa, in 1903, well before the First World War. But it wasn't really until after the war that the group that clustered around him, known as the Bloomsbury Group, ended up having a large impact. And so Moore's ideas ended up having much more significance than you might say the average academic text on ethics has, partly because a whole group of intellectuals, a really central and important group of intellectuals in Britain, adopted his theory as their own. One of those was the novelist D.M. Forster, and we'll be talking mostly about him today. But let's back up a little bit to the turn of the century. Before World War I, there was already this sense of alienation, this sense of cynicism, this loss of faith in traditional values. And we've talked some about that. It was growing among European intellectuals, not only people like George Bernard Shaw and Friedrich Nietzsche, but a larger group who were beginning to question things, beginning to worry that much of what they had believed in earlier, much of what their societies declared was important, was actually, in some sense, not as solid as it seemed. That grew, you might say despite, or maybe it was even because of, greater affluence, the greater spread of prosperity. Remember Shaw, in London, 1903, saying he could conceive of no viler criminal than someone who would create London in the form that it was then, no greater benefactor than the person who would destroy it. That's a remarkable thing to say about one's own civilization, and about what was, by general agreement then, the cultural, intellectual, financial center of the world. Well, some people have said it's really the case in general, that when life gets too easy, when people find things too simple in a way, when it's too easy to survive, people take a lot for granted, too much for granted, and begin to attack, turn against the values that made that prosperity and affluence possible. And maybe that's what was going on. People started taking things for granted. They started turning against the system that had actually made possible the kind of life they were leading, and the result of that was disaster. Or it might be that somehow this was an intellectual force that had nothing to do with economic conditions or prosperity or anything like that, but was really something due to the nature of ideas. Maybe it was the beginning of Christianity's fading as a cultural force. Maybe it was something else. But whatever was going on here, there was a sense in which many people at the turn of the 19th to the 20th century, in the year 1900, would have said, this is the height of human civilization. We've finally figured it all out. We're in a world at peace. Affluence is spreading. Prosperity is spreading. It looked like an age of progress and an age of faith. And yet there were these voices already saying, no, something is wrong. Well, as I mentioned a moment ago, World War I greatly amplified these tendencies and spread them among a much larger group. Not just a group of intellectuals, but really out into the population at large. And we've seen a number of different forms that reaction took. In some cases, it was a real bitterness, as in the war poets. People saying, I have been lied to. I was told this and that love of country and patriotism and courage and so on were important values. I was told that it would be fitting and glorious to give my life for my country, and then I ended up in the trenches and I saw something very different. All of that went out the window with the first death that I witnessed, which is what Remarque says in All Quiet on the Western Front. Some people responded with a sense of nostalgia for an age that was now being lost, with a sense of decline, with fear. We've seen that in T.S. Eliot and also in William Butler Yeats, this sense that civilization has really been injured by the war, that it's starting to collapse, or it's been fragmented, it's been broken. We also see people like Kipling trying to put it all back together, trying to revive a sense of tradition that they see as being under attack. Kipling's response is, look, it wasn't the values we held that led us into this war. It was people straying from those values that led us into this war. We've got to go back and revitalize those values that we had taken maybe for granted before, but that nevertheless had yielded that age of faith and progress. And then we see in people like Freud, in Pirandello, in the artists we're going to be talking about next week, this temptation to believe in irrationality. To say, look, it wasn't reason that got us into this war, it was irrational, but the response isn't to strengthen reason somehow, but to admit that much of human life is just driven by irrationality. We saw that thought in Nietzsche, it's there in Freud, it's there in Pirandello, this idea that if you peel back the conscious surface and look beyond reason to something deeper in our psyche, you find, well, something bizarre, something seemingly unintelligible, something shocking, something frightening. Well, philosophers during this interwar period, after the First World War, in a number of cases, decided that it was up to them to try to revive ethics, to try to put norms on a new foundation, to try to say, well, all right, maybe traditional values can't be simply revived in exactly the same form, but maybe we can find a new foundation for adding the ought to the is, a new foundation for thoughts about morality, about practical reason, about a social ideal, and so forth. Well, their views ended up having a large impact, not just among philosophers, but on an entire generation of leaders. These people that we're going to be talking about today at Cambridge were crucial in teaching a whole generation of British leaders, people who later became prime ministers, people who later became leaders in parliament, in other ways, in some cases, people who ended up being spies for the opposition. But whatever happened, they were people who actually had a significant political impact. Now, I want to go back to something Marx said that we barely remarked upon as we were going through the Communist Manifesto. The ruling ideas of an age are the ideas of its ruling class. The ruling ideas of the age are the ideas of the ruling class. That's a claim that basically says the main ideas of a time and the interests, the economic interests, the political interests of the ruling class tend to coincide. Marx himself thought the intellectuals were a special slice of the bourgeoisie who somehow managed to identify with the proletariat and so express proletarian desires being, an obvious objection to Marx is, wait a minute, if everything is really driven by economic interest, how can you write something like the Communist Manifesto? You're obviously not a laborer, and in fact, this kind of intellectual production seems incompatible with one of the proletariat. So how could it happen? Why aren't your ideas, in other words, the ideas of the ruling class? His answer is, well, somehow this group of intellectuals breaks away and manages to identify with interests that are different from those of the ruling class. Well, there was a time, you might say, when actually intellectual interests did tend to overlap heavily with the interests of the ruling class. After all, when a small number of people were being educated, and it required a tremendous amount of leisure, a tremendous amount of money, a certain social position to gain an education, then yes, the ideas being expressed by that educated group tended to be the ideas of the ruling class because those people were part of the ruling class. But by the 1920s, that was changing. After all, literacy was now virtually universal. Lots of people were experiencing higher education. And so all of a sudden, that sort of condition that had been commonplace up to that time really started to change. Julien Benda was a French intellectual who said that really now for the first time, the class generating ideas, this intellectual class, sees itself primarily and permanently opposed to the ruling class. So Benda's idea is, look, what Marx said was more or less true up to Marx's time, and maybe even up to the First World War. but that after the war, intellectuals tended to identify their own interests in opposition to their society, in opposition to the aristocracy, in opposition to the ruling class, no longer expressing the views of that class, but instead as a kind of counterculture opposing it. And so here is a picture of the traditional intellectual, there in the library, this foggy-headed looking guy. Benda's book is called The Treason of the Clerics, sometimes translated as The Treason of the Intellectuals. It came out in 1927. And he basically argues that for the first time in at least memorable history, this intellectual group is treasonous. It's destructive of society. Now, I mentioned that this was the first time in the modern era because, after all, Socrates was put to death in ancient Athens. And so it wasn't the first time that it was thought that the intellectuals were acting as a treasonous group within society. The ancient Greeks thought that about Socrates. But at this point, you might say it was a new thing. For many, many years, it had looked as if the intellectuals gave voice to the views of the aristocracy. And those who weren't part of the aristocracy really never had the education or the opportunity to make their voices heard, at least very loudly. Now, I think that's too simple a picture. There are obviously different strands to intellectual culture and lots of things you could say. Shakespeare would seem an obvious counterexample here, for example, but let's leave that aside. That's Benda's view, at any rate, that it went this way up to this time, but now all of a sudden there is a group that is setting itself up in opposition, not just to a particular ruling group, not just in particular to that aristocracy, but in a sense to their entire societies. Now, what's happening as those people take over cultural institutions is that they create a generation of leaders who no longer identify with their own society, who no longer identify with its values, no longer identify with its cultural ideals. And so Benda sees this as an immensely dangerous situation. You've got a group of intellectuals who themselves feel alienated from their societies, who see themselves in opposition to it. They start training other people. Those people don't just become more disaffected intellectuals, they actually end up in positions that are important in society, but they don't believe in the society they lead. Now, here is the underlying thought. He says, humanity did evil for 2,000 years, but honor good. This contradiction was an honor to the human species and formed the rift, whereby civilization slipped into the world. Think about Nietzsche, who says in the end, the real value is authenticity. You are to become the person you are. Benda says, actually, there's a lot of value in hypocrisy. Okay? Sometimes it's better for people not to be authentic. Sometimes it's good to be a hypocrite. Why? Because at least you put forward those high ideals that you don't live up to. And it's really in that gap, that statement of those ideals you don't live up to, that, well, civilization slips into the world. That makes possible those higher ideals. But lose that, insist on authenticity, you close that gap, and actually you threaten civilization itself. So you might see hypocrisy as the homage, as the saying goes, vice pays to virtue. Get rid of hypocrisy, maybe you get rid of vice, but it's much more likely you get rid of virtue. So how does all this go? Well, he says all of this changed. Early in the 20th century, there was a promotion of authenticity, as in Nietzsche, a denunciation of hypocrisy. People began to attack those traditional values, not so much because the values were wrong, but because people weren't really living up to them. And so people abandoned those traditional ideals. They abandoned any universal sense of what could be a foundation for an ought, for moral values, for any kind of social norm. And when intellectuals abandon them, well, so who cares? What difference does it make if a Friedrich Nietzsche or a George Bernard Shaw abandons them and stops believing? They have an effect on other people. Now, how does that intellectual group have that effect? Suppose some group of writers all of a sudden gets some ideas. They start writing things, they start putting on plays, as in Shaw's case, expressing this new set of ideas. So what? How does it affect you? Yeah?
It's a challenge to what you already know.
Well, it's a challenge to what you already know, but on the other hand, you might, how many of you have been to plays in New York? Okay, more than I would have thought. a significant number, but lots of you haven't, right? How many of you actually read contemporary novels? I mean, I've read a novel, that's a sort of intellectual novel, not kind of like the latest romance or science fiction novel, but I mean, you know, a sort of serious novel, the kind of thing that gets reviewed in the New York Review of Books, that's been published over the last 10 years. Again, more than a few than I would have thought. But you might say, relatively few people are actually going to go to these plays, right? Relatively few people are actually going to read those books. So some people are going to be affected. How does it get out to the rest of society? Yeah?
It could be argued that a lot of people decide to go to these places and read these books and aspirations in society so they can walk in and understand that politics can affect other people who care about what's happening.
Okay, good. She's saying, look, it might not matter if all that many people are affected, because the people who just raised their hands in response to those questions might be the people who are most likely to actually end up as leaders. The people who are most likely to actually end up, let's say, as professors, or as politicians, or as leaders in whatever field, and spreading those ideas in that form. And so it could well be that even if it goes to a relatively small group, that group is influential. They have effect on a wider group, and so on. It might spread out like waves, right? You drop the rock into the pond, and you might say, well, that rock is just affecting that one spot, right? It's hitting right there. Relatively few water molecules are displaced by that rock. But then the circle starts spreading out from that point. And so that's one way of looking at how this effect goes. What's another way in which these ideas spread throughout the larger society? Yeah? People talking to one another. Good, in media. So people discuss this. How many people read some of these novels? Well, in some cases, not all that many, but a lot might read reviews of those novels. They might talk about them even though they haven't read them. I mean, have you ever talked about a book you have not read? Probably, yeah, an embarrassing number of times, right, in your English classes and so on. And so that's something that happens. People don't talk about these ideas, even if they haven't originally read the book or seen the play. So that's another way in which these things spread, person to person. Are there other ways? Yeah?
Well, let's say like they affect people's experiences so that even if they're not talking directly about it, they will affect like the way that they talk about other things.
That's an interesting point. A lot of this can be subconscious. So it might be that the person doesn't actually think about that novel or that play very often later, but it may shape the way they see things. And so the effects could be quite subtle. And somebody could go back and say, all right, you know, at a certain point you stopped thinking like that and you started thinking like this. Why? You might not be able to say, oh, because I read that book or saw that play or whatever, but it might change your perceptions enough that actually that happens, despite the fact that you couldn't put your finger on the moment that happened. It happens sort of subtly and slowly and beyond your conscious awareness. Of course, there's another possibility. These people, as in the case of the ones we're about to discuss, they're mostly professors. And so they teach students. Spread these ideas. Look, I'm doing it right now. I'm spreading these ideas. Okay? And so that's another way in which this happens. In many cases, these were professors who were not themselves involved in politics, but whose students ended up being so involved. Well, we've talked about that idea in Nietzsche. You're to become the person you are. That ideal of authenticity. That's something that was taken seriously and put in a particular form by a group at Cambridge known as the Bloomsbury Group. It was a group centered around Cambridge University, though it also involved some other intellectuals. In general, these people were hedonistic. They believed in short-term pleasures. They also were quite retiring. They didn't, for the most part, get involved in public life. They tended to stay in their own little group and write. They were very concerned with the boundary between the private and the public, and were especially concerned with private life. As we'll see, it was really the private things that they thought of as the most important, and that makes it especially ironic that their ideas had a huge impact on the public. They believed in the value of introspection, of friendship, and they were deeply antagonistic to traditional values. Here you see a photograph of some of the key members of the group lounging around, and those kinds of photographs are common. You don't tend to see members of this group in action shots, okay? In a sense, Lytton Strachey there in his chair, that is an action shot for Lytton Strachey. You see these people sitting around thinking, occasionally writing. Very few of them actually do much of anything. Here's another picture. Now, the intellectual guru of the group was someone who was a bit older than most of the rest, G.E. Moore. He was a very influential philosopher, one of the key philosophers in England at the time. He was a colleague of Bertrand Russell and Ludwig Wittgenstein at Cambridge, and so part of a very, very elite group. He and Russell, in fact, were Wittgenstein's dissertation committee. And he was close friends with many members of the Bloomsbury Group. That included novelists like E.M. Forster or Virginia Woolf, Lytton Strachey, who wrote a book called Eminent Victorians, John Maynard Keynes, the famous economist. Now, I mentioned a moment ago that his key work was Principia Africa, the Principles of Ethics, established or published in 1903. And he raises right at the beginning of the book a fundamental question of ethics. He says, in fact, it is the fundamental question of ethics. It's the question, what things are goods or ends in themselves? What are the things we pursue, not just in order to get other things, but as ultimate ends in themselves? What do we take to be good in itself? Aristotle had drawn a distinction between instrumental goods, things that were good for the sake of something else, and then intrinsic goods, things that were good for their own sake. Now, there are lots of instrumental goods. Can you think of some? They're not really good in themselves. They're good for what they can do. They're good for achieving some other end. Yeah? A calculator. Good. A calculator is something that is an instrumental good. It's good for the sake of doing something, namely calculating, solving mathematical problems. It's not like people just collect calculators and say, what are you going to use that calculator for? Oh, I just like having it. It's good for something. What are some other examples of instrumental goods? Yeah?
Medical marijuana.
Medical marijuana. Okay. Yeah, it's important there that you say medical, because you might say that's something that somebody is using for a particular reason to achieve some other end. Grandma, I didn't take you to be the type who would be, found with Maui Wowie. And it's just for glaucoma, dear. It's purely for accomplishing some other end. What are some other examples of this kind of thing? Yeah. Electricity. It's good for what it can do, for what it can accomplish. Not necessarily just good for itself. Yeah. Money is like this, exactly. The father of a good friend of mine, back in junior high and high school and college, used to say, I don't care about money, I just care about the things money can buy. And that was a way of saying, look, money is valuable, but as an instrumental good. Well, what are the things that are really good for their own sake? Some of these might also be good for the sake of some other things. So I think these categories overlap. But then Aristotle calls final the things that are always good for their own sake and never for the sake of something else. But for now, let's put aside that distinction and just think, what are some things that are valuable for their own sake? They're not just tools. They're not just useful for getting you to that. They're just good by themselves. Yeah? Health. Exactly. Health is one of those things in that overlap. It is good to be healthy because then it enables you to accomplish all sorts of other ends, but health is an end in itself. It's good to be healthy, and that's something that is an end in itself. So that's a great example of something that is good in itself, but also as a means to other things. It is both intrinsic and instrumental, you might say. Some other things like that. Yeah? Family. Okay, good. You might value your family members as ends in themselves, as intrinsically good, not as just as good for what they can do for you, right? Your brother calls you up on the phone and says, hey, how you doing? And you say, well, I don't want to talk to you. What have you done for me lately? No, you value those family relationships for their own sake, not just for the sake of what your parents can do for you or what money they can send you or what have you. Other things like that, yeah. Sweets, okay, good. Think about a piece of candy. A really good piece of candy. I mean, whatever your favorite treat is, there are certain things before which I am utterly weak-willed. A lot of things I can resist. I don't have many food cravings. But put me in front of peanut M&Ms, and I am powerless. Then I just, I can't have them around because I just consume them all. Okay, I can't say no. And I always think, well, I'll just have one or two.
No.
And that becomes 1 or 2 dozen. And then I don't achieve even that. But in any case, yeah, that might be something you value for its own sake. In fact, at one point, a philosopher on the blog said, what are some things you value for their own sakes? Maybe I mentioned this earlier. And one of the examples I gave was a Southside shake. This ice cream shop near where I grew up makes these amazing shakes. It is a fantastic milkshake topped with an ice cream sundae. Any flavor you want. So I get chocolate milkshake topped with a peanut butter sundae. It's like 1,000,000 calories, but it is awesome. Okay? And so that's something that I would say I value for its own sake. Certainly for not for what it can do for me. I mean, I live with what it's done for me, but that's something that's fantastic just for its own sake. Other things that you would value for their own sakes. Yeah?
Education.
Education. Okay, good. Knowledge is another one of those things that we tend to value for its own sake. Aristotle begins the metaphysics by saying everyone by nature desires to know. And so knowledge, education, is something we value for its own sake. Now, often knowledge is also valued for the sake of something else. And so you might think, well, actually, I hope my education gets me a job or puts me on some path to a career and so on. But, yeah, so it has an instrumental value too. But knowledge in general is one of those things that's valued for its own sake as well as for the sake of something else. Now, there are particular bits of knowledge that might be valued strictly for what they can do for you. I had to look up recently how to change the taillight in my car. I don't really value that for its own sake. It's not like, well, you know, being a taillight expert, I just like doing that. No, it was really just to accomplish a certain end. But there are lots and lots of kinds of knowledge that I pursue because I want to know, independently of anything it might do for me. Okay, so that's something that is key. And we've been talking about examples here of things that do seem good in themselves. Now, a lot of those things are valued for their own sake, but could be valued for the sake of something else too. Aristotle says there's one thing that is always valued for its own sake and never for the sake of something else. What could be like that? Well, his answer is happiness. Living well. Flourishing. We always value that for its own sake, never for the sake of something else. Why do you want to know this? Why do you want to have a career and so on? Why do you want to have a family? Why do you blah, blah, blah? It's all because I, in the end, want to be happy. I want to live well. I want to thrive, flourish. And Aristotle's sense here is a very broad one. Not just that sense of happiness of feeling good at the moment, but rather feeling a sense of living well. I have a friend who's an Aristotelian, and when I see him, he always greets me and says, "Daniel, are you flourishing?" And, and he's asking me whether, I'm experiencing what Aristotle would have called eudaimonia, whether I am thriving in Aristotle's sense. By the way, back when I was philosophy department chairman, I tried to hire him here because he's such a flamboyant professor. He's a very fine ethical thinker, but also immense fun to listen to. It did not work out. His girlfriend made him stay in New York. But I don't know if they're still together, actually.
Yeah, you can't
Some part of me hopes not. Just on revenge. Anyway, this is something that, I hope he's flourishing, but I wish he were flourishing here. Now, there are other possible answers to this question. So, for example, here's a traditional Christian answer to the question of what is this ultimate good? Something always desired for its own sake, never for the sake of something else. From the Westminster Catechism, to glorify God and enjoy Him forever. That's the answer to the very first question in the Catechism, what is the meaning of life? To glorify God and enjoy Him forever. Or, here is, there's another answer missing here. Well, I guess we'll get to it. Anyway, here is G.E. Moore's answer. Personal affections and aesthetic enjoyments include all the greatest and by far the greatest goods we can imagine. They are the things, he thinks, we seek ultimately for their own sake and not for the sake of something else. So if for Aristotle, all chains of asking why are you doing that? Why did you come to class today? Well, to learn. Why do you want to learn? Partly I value it for its own sake. Partly I want to get a good grade. Why do you want a good grade? Well, I want a good GPA. Why do you want a good GPA? So that I can get a good job. Why do you want a good job? Well, because I want money and I want a career. Why do you want money and a career? Well, ultimately it's going to be because Whatever it is, makes me happy. Okay, I want happiness. But it's a different answer in Moore. He says, no, it is personal affections and aesthetic enjoyments. Now that's a surprising answer. He says, by far the most valuable things we know or can imagine are certain states of consciousness, things internal, which may be roughly described as the pleasures of human intercourse. Get your minds out of the gutter. He just means human interaction, okay? And the enjoyment of beautiful objects. I mentioned the father of my best friend back in junior high and so on. Let me tell you another story about that family. When did my friend get the talk about the birds and the bees? When they happened to be driving through Intercourse, Pennsylvania, a little town in Pennsylvania, Dutch country. Mom and Dad started laughing about the side, and Jim said, well, why is that funny? Well, anyway. Okay, so that and the enjoyment of beautiful objects. Those, he says, are the two things that are the ultimately valuable things. Now, notice what he's claiming here. It's not just that those are the best things. He says, it is only for the sake of these things, in order that as much of them as possible may at some time exist, that anyone can be justified in performing any public or private duty. So these are the only ultimate values. He's not saying, oh yeah, happiness, and to glorify God, and to experience beauty, and to experience the pleasures of human interaction. He's not saying that. He's saying, no, it's only these things. Everything comes down to this. Everything is ultimately about human relationships and about the appreciation of beauty. They are the raison d'etre of virtue. They are the reason we care about virtue and vice, right and wrong, good and bad. In the end, it's all about beauty, and it's about social interaction. It is they, he says, that form the rational, ultimate end of human action. And, notice, the sole criterion of social progress. So it isn't just that I organize my personal life around seeking human interaction and aesthetic enjoyment. It is that that's the measure of a society. What are the social ideals here? They all come down to the formation of human relationships and the appreciation of beauty. So how do we judge societies? On the basis of the human relationships within them and on the basis of the beauty that is appreciated by the people within them. That's what it all comes down to. Well, you might think that's a surprising answer. So what are some things that might be left out of this picture? Now, some things he would say are really, enjoyed as instruments to the appreciation of beauty, or instruments to the formation of these human relationships. But you might think a lot of things aren't. So what are some things that seem left out of this picture that it would be hard to explain or understand if the only things of ultimate value are aesthetic enjoyments and social relationships? Yeah?
Like achievements?
Good, achievements. Okay, you might think it's good not just to appreciate beauty, but like to produce beauty. What about Michelangelo doing a beautiful sculpture, right? And achieving that. Yes, there's the appreciation of beauty there that he enjoys and that we enjoy, but there's also the sense of accomplishment. Of course, a lot of accomplishments aren't accomplishments that result in an object of beauty like that. Maybe Moore could explain that one. But what about a different kind of accomplishment? An accomplishment that does not involve beauty at all. Can you think of any accomplishments where it's hard to describe the end result as, in any sense, beautiful or childbirth? Gee, well, yeah, I've witnessed 2 childbirths, and I almost passed out at the first one. But on the other hand, Moore could say something about that, right? I mean, the human relationships part.
Yeah.
A new human is coming into the world. But are there other kind of accomplishments where you wouldn't want to say, so take a look at that? Yeah.
Political achievement.
Maybe a political achievement. Okay, good. You might accomplish something political, but in the end, you wouldn't look at it and say, oh, that's beautiful. Maybe, for example, you succeed in being elected to Congress. You win the election, and you're there at your victory speech. Do you think, the beauty of congressional power? Right? No. I mean, and is it about, oh, good, I'll meet so many new people? No, it's not really about that either. So that sense of accomplishment might be different. I had in mind, maybe it's just because Grandpa was a plumber, but I had in mind something nastier. Like, you know, the toilet clogs, and you managed to clear it, yay! But you don't say, oh, that was beautiful, right? And you don't really want to talk about it with other people. It's not something that helps you with human interactions. Though maybe a clogged toilet does create problems for human interactions. Other things, yeah.
The creation and use of nuclear weapons.
The creation and use of nuclear weapons. Ooh. Well, let's see, is that a good thing? Let's grant that it's a good thing. Because if it's not a good thing, then it's not really relevant. But if it were a good thing, yeah, it wouldn't be because it helps with human relationships, would it? Or would it? I mean, here's what more could say. Well, actually, a weapon system could be a valuable thing. And why? Because actually it protects people. And in that sense, defends human relationships and aesthetic enjoyments. So the use of a bomb itself certainly wouldn't be beautiful. But on the other hand, you might say that overall, it's done in order to create as great as possible human relationships and aesthetic enjoyments. Yeah.
So when you pick out an achievement and you say that it doesn't have an intrinsic beauty, wouldn't you, to some degree, just argue that then you're doing it for a higher cause, and that cause, the reason why you're doing it is something of beauty? Because if you're doing it just for the sake of doing it, you must find some degree of beauty in it. If you don't find any beauty, it's like unclogging a toilet, you're doing it so you can use the restroom. Yes, is, you know,
It's a beautiful thing using a toilet.
it has a different purpose.
Okay, good. Yeah, in fact, if we expand this notion of beauty, it might seem as if actually more isn't telling us much. Take whatever ideal you want, attaining political power, or achieving something like writing a term paper, or cleaning the toilet, or whatever, and you see a beauty in that accomplishment. Then you're using beauty in a sense that's so broad that you've actually included any end at all. And so then, it's not that what he's saying would be false, but it wouldn't have much content either. I think he really does mean, literally, an appreciation of beauty. And he talks about beautiful objects, beautiful people. And so he doesn't just mean the beauty of an accomplishment, the beauty of finishing that term paper and smiling and saying, I did it, right? Or the accomplishment of cleaning the toilet, or finally finishing your taxes, or whatever it is. He doesn't want to use it in that broad way, or else he's not really going to be making much of a claim. Well, there are a number of great writers in this group. Virginia Woolf is one of them, and she managed to write a number of great novels. The person I want to focus on, though, is somebody who doesn't require us to get some of the key ideas to read a bunch of novels. And so I've tried using Virginia Woolf in the past. She's wonderful, but you have to read a lot to get some of the key ideas. Forster not only wrote these novels, things like Where Angels Fear to Tread, A Room with a View, Howard's End, A Passage to India, but also wrote an essay that we're going to concentrate on. Oh, there he is. He wrote a book called What I Believe, Two Cheers from Democracy, and What I Believe is an essay in that book. And it begins this way with a rather shocking statement. I do not believe in belief. Now, that is sort of surprising. The title is What I Believe. You say, oh, what do you believe, Forster? I don't believe in belief. Gee, you might expect this a very short chapter. I don't believe in belief, the end. Now, there's something a little surprising about that. All belief? I mean, presumably there are things you believe that Forster doesn't want to challenge that you believe, right? So, there are lots of humdrum beliefs. What are some beliefs you have right now about what's happening in this classroom? Oh, you have a belief that all the information I'm giving you is correct. Wow, thank you, you're a man of faith. Or, what can I say here? This is something... Sorry, no, the reason I'm smiling is that a good friend of mine specializes in Indian philosophy, and when he came up for tenure, I remember telling him, listen, you're writing about all these figures none of the rest of us have ever heard of. So we're taking it on faith that these people actually existed. It actually wrote this stuff and said this stuff you said. Since none of us can read Sanskrit, we have no idea. So we're taking this all on faith, you know. We have to believe that you actually, believe this and that it's all correct. And in a way, well, if it weren't for Wikipedia and such things, you'd be in the same position. But you can actually say, oh wait, did Forster really write these novels and come with this up? But admittedly, there's a certain amount of faith that what I'm telling you is right. And so maybe a belief you have is that everything that I'm saying is true. Suppose I have the belief that some of the things that you're saying is false. Well, never mind, I'm trying to create a paradox here. But I have in mind something super simple. Some obvious beliefs, some things that don't require much of a leap of faith, but are right there in front of you. Yeah?
The class will end.
That the class will end at 2:50. Good, that might be something that you believe. What are some other beliefs that you have? Yeah. That you're here, yes. You might be like Descartes. I am, I think. Okay, I believe that I am. I believe that I think. I believe that I believe that I think. Those are things that you might have as beliefs. Well, he's not really meaning to challenge that. But he is meaning to challenge certain kinds of beliefs. Okay? Belief in a different sense. Wilfred Sellers used to tell this joke in class. Someone asked somebody else, do you believe in infant baptism? And the person says, hell yes, I've seen it done. That's a different sense of belief, right? I mean, yeah, I believe that it happens. It's another thing to say, well, you believe that infants should be baptized. And it's really that sense of belief that Forster has in mind. Not just like belief that what I'm saying is true, belief that you're here, belief that the class will end, but believing in things in that sense. Now, what's happening here is that Forster and other members of the Bloomsbury Group are trying to replace traditional morality with something like war's alternative. So here are some things they oppose. Faith, patriotism, traditional moral ideals. They take the ideals of the 19th century and they explicitly are trying to undermine those. They're saying, no, those aren't the ultimate goods. Instead, it is personal relationships and aesthetic enjoyments. And so they're opposing any system of morality that's based on something else. Well, a lot of philosophers think of moral ideals in terms of virtues. And so we could ask, what are the virtues you take as most important? What are your moral ideals? How do you want to live? How do you want people to think about you, talk about you? There are a number of different answers. Here is Walter Pater's 19th century answer. To burn with a hard, gem-like flame. To live with intensity. How do you want to be remembered? Somebody who lived with intensity, who had ideals and fiercely defended and pursued those ideals. Here's a Christian answer in terms of the virtues of faith, hope, and charity. Okay, faith, to believe, to be strongly committed to your beliefs. Hope, to seek to improve yourself and the world around you. Charity, to put others, including your country, ahead of yourself. Here is Eliot's answer, given right at the end of The Wasteland. Damyata, data, dayava. Self-control, giving, and mercy. Well, Strachey wrote a book, Eminent Victorians, that I mentioned, in 1980, right at the end of the First World War. It mocked these 19th century ideals. Cyril Connolly said it was the first book of the 1920s. He struck a note of ridicule which the whole war-weary generation wanted to hear. Rudyard Kipling said it was downright wicked in its heart. Well, what was this book like? There's Strachey again, in his backyard with Virginia Woolf and others. Yeah, there's Strachey again. I mean, he looks the same in all of these. Now, he mocks Victorians who were trying to dedicate their lives to those ideals of faith, hope, and charity, who were trying to educate or help others. So, one of them is Cardinal Manning. He was famous for the Rule of Faith sermon. He converted from Anglicanism to Catholicism. He defended faith and tried to claim that faith was a very important virtue. So he's one of the targets of the book. Another is Thomas Arnold, Matthew Arnold's father. He represents hope. He was the headmaster of the rugby school, as well as a professor of modern history at Oxford. He was somebody who was an educator, trying to educate people, trying to improve others in the future. One is General Gordon. He represents allegiance to country, charity in the sense of putting your country ahead of yourself. He led campaigns in China and Africa. He put down the Taiping Rebellion. He worked to stamp out slavery in the Sudan. And he died defending Khartoum against a Muslim siege. And the last one is Florence Nightingale. She represents charity. She founded the first school of nursing and changed the way wounded people are treated in wartime. Now I want to give you a little of the flavor of this by showing you the beginning of his chapter on Florence Nightingale. Everyone knows the popular conception of Florence Nightingale, the saintly, self-sacrificing woman, the delicate maiden of high degree who threw aside the pleasures of a life of ease to succor the afflicted, the lady with the lamp, gliding through the horrors of the hospital at Scutari, and consecrating with the radiance of her goodness the dying soldier's couch. The vision is familiar to all. But the truth was different. The Miss Nightingale of fact was not as facile fancy painted her. She worked in another fashion, and toward another end, she moved under the stress of an impetus which finds no place in the popular imagination. A demon possessed her. Now demons, whatever else they may be, are full of interests. And so it happens that in the real Miss Nightingale there was more that was interesting than in the legendary one. There was also less that was agreeable. Okay, and the whole book is like that. Now, let's get back to Forster. I do not believe in belief, he says. Why? They give people things to live for, to die for, to kill for. And in the end, they never really put much of this into practice, except for Keynes. They were thoroughly pacifist, however. They were arguing for the moral superiority, in fact, of Germany. And Lytton Strachey was actually prosecuted for refusing the draft and leading protests against the war. When he was in court, the prosecutor asked him this question. Tell me, Mr. Strachey, what would you do if you saw a German soldier attempting to rape your sister? Strachey, who was a flamboyant homosexual, responded in this way. I should try to come between them. Now, being gay was still shocking in Britain at the time, but nevertheless, this brought down the house. People thought this was a very funny response. And I'll close with Forster's most famous quotation. I hate the idea of causes, and if I had to choose between betraying my country and betraying my friend, I hope I should have the guts to betray my country.